Welcome to the show, everybody. This is Craig Pasta Jardula. I am the captain, and this is LOL, where the left critiques itself and laughs out loud to keep itself from crying. I am here with my co-host, Jeremy Kuzmarov, who teaches at Tulsa Community College, and he's also an author of many books, including his new book. It's a must-read, Warmonger. It's a book about the Clintons. If you want to go check that out, go ahead and order it today. Professor, how you doing?
Very good, thanks.
Well, thank you so much for coming back on. There's a lot of things we have to talk about. There's some craziness not just going on in Israel, in Gaza, with the whole situation, but in Russia, Ukraine. A lot of things happened over the last week. We saw the Russians put Zelensky on a wanted list. A lot of people are insinuating that they can now whack him if they want to. We see French troops who are actually now inside of Ukraine and getting ready to fight, and that's really pissing off the Russian Federation. Also, the fact that the Brits have said that they can use British weaponry to shoot down or shoot at if the Ukrainians use British weaponry, that's okay. And the Russians are not happy about that. Comments from people like, what's the leader of the House over there, our good friend, the Democrats. He's AIPAC's little darling over there. He has made comments too as well. The speaker, not the speaker, but the Democratic leader, Hakeem Jeffries, with his comments. I mean, so many things have flared up, not to mention we have this story that just doesn't seem to be told, Professor, where we hear all the time about this Russian leader taking into custody some poor Ukrainians. This Ukrainian has been arrested in Moscow. I think there's an article out there that talked about a certain we want to get rid of the I believe the Democracy Now! Article, Jamie. If you want to pull that up first really quickly, the professor had mentioned that. What are you talking about when you talk about this Democracy Now!? What point of view they're taking, and a lot of the leftist media, the synthetic leftist media, the avenue they're taking inside of America when it comes to Russia, Ukraine.
Well, and are you going to show that clip?
We're going to show it right now, but set it up for us.
Well, I mean, it is striking to observe this. I think the left media is very critical of Israel. I think rightfully so. They're critical of U.S. arms supplies. Their protest, even the mainstream media has broadcast some of the Israeli atrocities. This has triggered massive protests, but there's been no protests about the Ukraine war. There's no moral outrage about U.S. weapon. There's outrage about U.S. weapon supplies to Israel, but on the left and in activist circles, but not Ukraine. And yet there was a $60 billion arms package to Ukraine that was just passed. And those weapons are going to kill people in eastern Ukraine and in Russia. And the Democracy Now! Reported on the arrest of Vladimir Karzamura is positions himself as an anti-war activist in Russia, and he was an opposition politician allied with Alexei Navalny. He was arrested over a year ago, and he's been in prison. And the National Endowment for Democracy is championing his cause. He's a political prisoner. This showed the oppression of the Russian government. Now, what's not being reported, is that, and Democracy Now! Is just following what the National Endowment for Democracy, the CIA, is saying. Oh, this is terrible. Moscow is an authoritarian state. But what they're not saying, is that Kara-Murza was lobbying with William Browder for sanctions. It was a key figure behind the Magnitsky Act, which is what transformed U.S.-Russian relations from Obama's reset to the imposition of sanction under fraudulent pretexts, and that poisoned U.S.-Russian relations. And he's championing Ukraine and the coup that took place in 2014, backed by the CIA in Ukraine. He's championing human rights atrocities carried out by Ukraine against the people of eastern Ukraine, attacked by Ukraine into Russia. He's championing regime change against his own country's government. Now, I don't think he necessarily, should be imprisoned for 25 years, but the double standard is they're not reporting the huge number of political prisoners within Ukraine. So they're creating this impression that Ukraine, only Russia is authoritarian. However, there are a mass number of political prisoners in Ukraine who are being tortured and rounded up. and some are being murdered. The head of the Socialist Party in Ukraine's parliament, Ilya Kiva, was gunned down and murdered and assassinated by Ukrainian agents tied with the CIA in Moscow. And Bogdan Saradiak was just arrested. He's a leader of a left-wing group, a youth group of the Trotskyist movement in Ukraine. He was just arrested and is facing 15 years to life in prison, and he's being tortured in prison. And the Democracy Now! Never reported on that. They only reported on Kara-Murza, leaving out who he was, that arguably he was a traitor against his own country, that he was really pro-war, supporting war on his own country and Ukrainian war. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean he should have been imprisoned. If they want to report on his imprisonment, I think they have a right to, but they should report on Ukraine, the arrest of people in Ukraine, to give a realistic picture that their massive human rights abuse is not just, there are some in Russia, but there are massive numbers in Ukraine, and that this is an authoritarian government led by Zelensky, who's torturing and assassinating his opponents. And that's a moral outrage that should generate protest, that the U.S. is supplying billions of dollars, that the CIA is training Zelensky's agents, who are the ones carrying out the torture and murder. Why are there no protests on college campuses for that? There should be, but Democracy Now! And other left media are not reporting on it, so people are not aware.
Yeah, it's a little inconsistent, and it's kind of laughable when you see people like within the squad, push back and wanting a ceasefire now, and not being able to get it. But still, they've allowed so much stuff to happen. They let it go too far. But none of them, and even the other day, AOC, one of the biggest areas which we need to concentrate on is stopping Vladimir Putin and the Russian army, right? That this is the major problem. Meanwhile, they just ignored the fact that we supported this proxy war, that we took away any sovereignty that Ukraine had in 2014 by funding and supporting the Maidan coup, and have puppets in play like Zelensky. Do you want to play that video real quickly? Do we have a video from the Democracy? You want to play the first couple minutes of it? Take a listen to this. What's going on right here?
Well, let me thank you all for being here today so that we can make it very, very clear that Vladimir Kara-Murza has not been forgotten. We stand with him, and we want the whole world to know about his courage and that he is not alone. Evgenia, I want you to know we appreciate you being here. We recognize that your courage through this, you've been a tower of strength for all of us. And we want everyone to understand that. While this program is going on, there's a station over there where we're writing letters to Vladimir. We encourage you all to participate in this. For you see, part of the cruelty of Russia today under Mr. Putin is to deny Vladimir the opportunity to communicate in a normal way. So this is the way that we can keep in touch with him and to let him know that he is not alone. Vladimir is my friend. We've met many times. He is a champion for human rights, and that's been his calling. He helped us to deal with the aftermath of the tragedy of Sergei Magnitsky. And together, working, we were able to pass legislation that put a sanction and penalty on those who commit these gross violations of human rights.
Enough of that. That's getting me nauseous. This really just drives me crazy because we have journalists like Julian Assange in jail. They never say anything. You want to talk about the government who didn't even say anything about Gonzalo Lira. Neither did Democracy Now! Neither did a lot of leftist channels. They just leave out these other voices that don't go along with their narrative. Listen, right now as we're doing the show live on YouTube, we're getting completely censored. They won't let me share it out to all platforms. The people are not getting the bell. They demonetize and censor anybody who pushes out against their narrative. Jeremy, when you hear this nonsense go on, right? Also the journalist who was jailed for the Washington Post, I think it was, where the Russians are claiming that he was sending information back to the government, like they had him, they had his ties. They want to speak out for these people, right? But the real journalists out there, nobody speaks out for them.
Yeah, that Evan Gershkovich, Gershenowitz, who's with the Wall Street Journal. But yeah, firstly, that was the National Endowment for Democracy. That clip came from a event that they hosted with the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. The National Endowment for Democracy is a CIA cutout organization that was founded in the 80s to promote propaganda, and they fixate on promoting anti-Putin propaganda, and they champion the cause of dissidents in Russia and China. Now, there are maybe some, real dissidents there, but I mean, there's a clear political agenda that they're promoting regime change. And they mentioned Magnitsky. They claim that, that was the whole pretext for the original sanctions in 2012 was based on the fraud. They claim that Magnitsky was this great whistleblower who was exposing abuse of the Russian government and was murdered in prison. In fact, the evidence indicate that he likely died of natural causes. But he was not a whistleblower. He was involved in a corporate crime with William Browder that stole millions of dollars from the Russian government, and it was a tax evasion scheme. And this has been uncovered by Lucy Commissar, who's a great investigative reporter, as well as a Russian filmmaker who's been banned, Andrei Nekrasov, who was actually anti-Putin, but when he investigated this, he saw what was going on. It was a fraud perpetrated against the Russian government. Then they created this false story that he was this great whistleblower, and that was the basis for sanctions. And there was no legitimate basis for the U.S. to impose sanctions. And this ruined Obama's reset policy, which was pushing the U.S. and Russia in a better course of cooperation and could have averted the disaster we're seeing going on now. And Vladimir Kara-Murza was a key figure in all that, as a key lobbyist with William F. Browder, who was a corporate criminal, hedge fund billionaire, who was tried in absentia for tax evasion in Russia, and who has a vendetta against the Putin government and has billions of dollars to spend to buy American politicians like Ben. You saw the guy, that was Ben Cardin, who was the sponsor of the Magnitsky Act, a good liberal. Yeah, right, liberal. He's a key architect of the disastrous policy that's leading us to World War III and the spending $1 billion on weapons against the Russian government, which had been actually very friendly to the United States. So this is all political theater. And why does democracy now fall prey to this? Either they lack brains or they're just doing the bidding of the establishment to promote this narrative that Russia is this horrible authoritarian country, but saying nothing about Ukraine. And there's no protest against the huge U.S. aid money to Ukraine. And the CIA is very instrumental in that repression. We have exposés in the New York Times that they have 12 bases in Ukraine since 2014, that they're training or created Ukrainian intelligence services that are carrying out the torture. There should be mass protests on campuses against the CIA and against a U.S. taxpayer funding torture, funding war, just like in Israel, Gaza.
Yeah, and it's crazy because you hear like all these people, the DSA, Democratic Socialists of America, right? Like AOC, she's one of them. She's raging out against Vladimir Putin. But now we see people demanding the release of Bogdan Sorotyuk, right? He's the socialist opponent of native proxy war from a Ukraine prison. And these are names we don't hear all the time. This is Vladimir Zelensky's socialist opponent who he has jailed. We can get on and talk about some of the churches that he's kind of raided and some of the people, the parties he's crushed and the channels he's shutting down. But tell us a little bit about Bogdan and why he's in jail and why it's important to ring the bell to bring attention to his name.
His case shows that Ukraine is much worse as far as political repression, because the Communist Party is a leading legal opposition party in Russia. And although there are some political prisoners in Russia, Putin is not banning all the leftist parties in the way that Zelensky is. And he's rounding up and imprisoning. Bogdan Sorotyuk was head of the Youth Trotskyist League. Now, the Communist Party is banned in Ukraine, the Socialist Party, all the leftist parties. So his case is just a spotlight, just like Ilya Kiva, was the head of the Socialist Party in Ukraine's parliament, and he was assassinated by Zelensky's agents. So, I mean, if you're a social, the DSA and AOC and Bernie claim to be socialists, why aren't they outraged that their fellow socialists are being tortured and murdered? Yet they're funding that government. They're supporting billion-dollar aid packages to that government and saying nothing that it's American intelligence service training the agents that are carrying out the dirty work. against these principled left-wing activists. And there should be an outcry and a movement to free Sirodiak and to protest any U.S. aid money and CIA support for the right-wing criminal government of Ukraine.
Jeremy, in your article that you wrote about Ukraine hunts down traitors helping Russia, they played this video. We saw this a long time ago, and it shows the SBU, which is a unit trained by the CIA, going up into an apartment building somewhere in Ukraine, and they actually just arrested somebody for putting up social media post, right, and being supportive of what Putin was doing, trying to work an avenue of peace, not so much with the Minsk Accord in this particular situation, but other areas, just online and commenting on what's going on. It seems to me that the United States has taught the Ukrainians the same tactic. Listen, if you want to go after somebody, regardless, you want to suppress their voice or suppress their message, just call them a terrorist. And that will work, and the American public will buy it. They did the same thing over here. They said they're helping go after terrorists. Can you give a little comment? The traitors, with the way the Ukrainians are just hunting down average everyday citizens who are just commenting online and want to find some avenue of peace between Russians and Ukrainians.
Yeah, and it showed the myth. The Biden administration is claiming this is a great war for democracy against Russian authoritarian. But when you shine a spotlight on Ukraine, you find this is one of the most authoritarian governments in the world. There was a 13-year-old girl, Faina Senenkova, and viewers could go to the Donbass Insider, which is a website that was actually telling the truth of some of what was going on in eastern Ukraine. And she was a 13-year-old, and she was arrested just for writing blog posts about what it was like growing up in a war environment. And so, yeah, the Mirotvoritz website, which had the imprint of the CIA, was putting up the names of journalists that were, that they wanted to be hunted down and assassinated. And when they were assassinated, they would, put an X over their photo, and they were thrilled that they were assassinated. So they're going after journalists, leftists, any party that considered pro-Russia is banned. But by pro-Russia, I mean they want cooperation with the Russians. And Zelensky had actually campaigned on that in 2019. That was a position supported by the majority of Ukrainians. And there are close ties historically between Ukraine and Russia, and particularly Eastern Ukrainian. Many of them are ethnic Russians, and they've never fought in centuries. So this is a horror show going on there. And the pseudo left in the United States has just totally capitulated on this issue to the powers that be. And it's reminiscent of the Phoenix program. In that article, I detail the history of the Operation Phoenix in Vietnam, where the CIA.
I was going to ask that, but before we get into the Phoenix Redux, right, the Phoenix program, which we should talk about, but I just want to point out that it's crazy to me that we talk about being freedom of speech, we're spreading democracy, and we see right now in Israel, Gaza, that the Israelis are banning Al Jazeera. We see that the Ukrainians are doing exactly what their big brother taught them in the United States as far as jailing their opponents. We got Julian Assange sitting in a prison in Belmarsh over here, still hasn't been charged with any crime. He just the Americans are just showing anybody who speaks out against them. It's terrible. You had AOC, who's still once again praising the Ukrainians for the fight against the Russians, but she also talked about here at home deplatforming people. We were demonetized on the Convo Couch the day after AOC had written a letter to telling her supporters to report people, to rat on their neighbors and stuff. So it's crazy. But let's talk about the Phoenix program. What exactly is the Phoenix program, and how does it relate to what we're seeing in Ukraine today?
Well, the Phoenix program, and Douglas Valentine wrote a brilliant study, and I also did a research project that was published as a book, Modernizing Repression, on police training program during the Cold War. The CIA and U.S., under the cover of USAID, was training police operatives, and what they were training them in political policing operations. They were providing sophisticated policing technologies so local police forces could establish data banks of subversives. And then once they had these data banks, they would methodically kidnap and arrest the people on the blacklist. and then they were sometimes they were outright assassinated, or they were often tortured or became political prisoners. And this was a key instrument of U.S. strategy in South Vietnam to try and eradicate, the Viet Cong, the National Liberation Front guerrillas who were fighting against the U.S. puppet government in South Vietnam and against U.S. bombing and military occupation. Even when they controlled a lot of areas, and they had set up shadow governments. So under Phoenix, the CIA would help the South Vietnamese proxies, known as provincial reconnaissance units, set up these blacklists, and then they would go in and arrest them or assassinate them or torture them. And William Colby, the CIA director, admitted at least 20,000 civilians were killed under this program. And it spun way out of control. Many of the PRU and Vietnamese were pursuing private vendettas. And, the American advisor didn't even speak Vietnamese. So people got on the blacklist. Whoever the local government officials or PRUs didn't like, they would put his name on the blacklist, and they could kidnap, torture, and assassinate him. And similarly in Ukraine, it's getting out of control. The CIA has been instrumental in Ukraine since the coup of 2014 in establishing a Phoenix-type operation and training the Ukrainian intelligence service. And we have some members of those intelligence services, defectors, speaking out and saying it's gotten out of control. This was actually reported in mainstream publications like The Economist, that it's gotten way out of control, like the Phoenix, and then they're just targeting random people, or the blacklists are all, are being manipulated, and local agents and proxies of the CIA are pursuing private feuds and vendettas. And anyone against Zelensky could be targeted under this Phoenix program. Like Ilya Kiva was one of the victims. We have politicians who are being assassinated, and journalists and others, in a Phoenix-type program that's spun way out of control.
Though the CIA, the sins of the CIA. We got about 2 minutes and 14 seconds left, Professor. There's talks often by the West, mainstream media, about how Russia commits so many war crimes. War crimes, Russia. War crimes, Russia. Can you give us a little analysis of what you're seeing as far as the war crimes that we're seeing from Ukraine that are not getting reported in the mainstream media, and not even getting reported by some of the independent media? We got a little bit under 2 minutes left, so please go ahead and give us your quick analysis of the war crimes committed by Ukraine.
Exactly. Therein lied the bias of the media as well as the alternative media on this. They're not reporting on Ukrainian crime. Like Democracy Now! Featured this film 20 Days in Mariupol, which was and the director, they had him on. This is an anti-Russia propaganda campaign. Yes, Russia has committed atrocities, but that film doesn't go into the context of the war, nor report on the massive Ukrainian atrocities, including in Donbass, where you were, in eastern Ukraine. Those atrocities started in 2014, and UN agencies reported that 80% of the bombing and shellings of cities was carried out by Ukrainian army with U.S., and these were U.S. weapons. And then the Bucha atrocity, that was blamed on the Russians to ratchet up aid, but an investigation by Scott Ritter and others found that it could only be based on the crime scene evidence. It had to have been Ukrainian neo-Nazi Azov units that committed those atrocities. So atrocities are being reported, carried out by Russia, that are actually Azov battalion atrocities. Democracy Now! Once reported that Russia struck a missile on a mall, but then footage showed that the mall was totally empty, abandoned years ago, and it was next to a missile facility. So that's the kind of biased reporting we're getting. And there's massive Ukrainian war crimes with U.S. weapons that are not being reported, and people should be protesting against U.S. weapons going for those war crimes, just like weapons to Israel or resulting in war crimes.
It's crazy what they're reporting. It's crazy what they're missing. It's even a shame that you see a lot of independent media sitting there supporting the Zelensky regime that was puppeted up and propped up by the United States government, the CIA, people like Victoria Nuland and whatnot. That's it for today. I am Craig Pasta Jardula, the captain, with the Professor Jeremy Kuzmarov. Thank you so much for watching and listening to LOL.